The wind howled like a hungry wolf across the desolate plains, whipping snow crystals into stinging needles against the single, solitary cabin clinging precariously to the frozen earth. Inside, Elara huddled deeper into the thin blankets, the cold seeping into her bones despite the meager fire in the hearth. The embers glowed faintly, a dying heart in the room, mirroring the life force flickering within her. Hunger was a gnawing ache, a constant companion since the last of the jerky had been consumed 2 days ago. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her husband, Gideon, had left weeks ago for the nearest town, promising to return with supplies before the worst of the winter hit. He never came back. She didn't know if he was lost to the snow, fallen prey to illness, or if he had simply ridden away and never looked back, abandoning her to this frozen tomb. The uncertainty was a separate, colder kind of agony. The cabin itself was failing. Drafts snaked through cracks in the walls, the roof leaked melting snow onto the floorboards, and the woodpile was dwindling faster than she could gather more, her strength failing with each passing day. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, tightening with every gust of wind, every shadow that danced in the firelight. She was trapped, vulnerable, a fly caught in the icy web of winter. Her gaze drifted to the window, the glass frosted thick with ice. Beyond lay only endless white, a landscape that offered no solace, only indifference. She closed her eyes, trying to conserve warmth, trying to ignore the tremors that shook her body. Whether from cold, hunger, or fear, she couldn't tell. The silence, when the wind briefly lulled, was vast and heavy, pressing down on her, amplifying the sound of her own shallow breathing. Survival felt like a distant dream, a cruel jest played by a world that had stripped her bare of everything. Dignity had vanished with the last crumb of food, replaced by a primal desperation that shamed her. She was reduced to a creature focused only on the next breath, the next fleeting moment of warmth. It was in this state of near collapse, lost in the haze of her own suffering, that something distant pricked her awareness. A flicker, a tiny, impossible spark in the oppressive darkness far across the snowy expanse. Her eyes, weary and strained, focused on the point. Was it a star, appearing through a break in the clouds? No, it was too steady, too low on the horizon. Hope, a dangerous and fragile thing, tentatively unfurled in her chest, quickly followed by a wave of terror. Who would be out there in this? Another soul lost or something far more dangerous? She watched, breath held tight in her lungs, as the distant light seemed to grow, then resolve into 2 points, moving slowly. It was a lantern. Someone was coming. The world, she realized with a jolt, was not entirely indifferent. It might be cruel, but it was not empty. Not yet. The sound of hooves crunching on frozen snow, faint at first, grew steadily louder, a rhythmic beat against the vast silence. Elara pushed herself up, her limbs weak and trembling, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had no weapon, nothing but a dying fire and the fragile walls of her cabin. As the sound grew closer, the fear intensified, eclipsing the brief flicker of hope. It was not the town's direction. Who could this be? Silas had seen the light from his own cabin miles away, a pinprick in the black ocean of the winter night. Strange. No one lived out there, not for years, not since the last family gave up and moved east. Curiosity, a quiet, persistent thing in his solitary life, had gnawed at him. He'd waited a day watching. The light remained. It wasn't random. Someone was tending it. Against his usual caution, the isolation out here taught you to mind your own business. He'd saddled his horse, packed minimal supplies, and ridden out. The wind was brutal, a relentless sculptor of drifts, but his horse was strong, and he knew this land like the lines on his weathered hands. As he approached the cabin, the state of it became starkly clear, even in the lantern light. It was a ruin barely standing, sagging under the weight of snow and age. Smoke, thin and pathetic, curled from the chimney. He dismounted, his boots crunching loud in the stillness. He stood for a long moment, observing. No dog barked. No movement stirred inside. Only the faint light and the struggle of smoke against the wind spoke of life. He walked closer, his hand resting lightly on the pistol at his hip, a habit born of necessity. Reaching the small porch, he saw the woodpile, pathetic and low, covered haphazardly. He stepped up and knocked, the sound echoing in the silence, feeling strangely intrusive. No answer. He waited, knocked again, louder. Still silence. Concern warred with his ingrained caution. He could ride away. It wasn't his problem. But the silence felt heavy, wrong. He peered through the dirty, frosted pane of the window next to the door. The light inside was weak, but he could make out shapes. A table, a chair, and something else. A figure huddled near the hearth. Motionless. He knocked a third time, his voice low but firm. "Hello? Anyone in there?" A faint sound came from within, a weak gasp, then silence again. He tried the door handle. It was unlocked. He hesitated for a moment, the cold logic of the wilderness telling him to leave, the quiet pull of something else urging him forward. He pushed the door open slowly. The cold inside was only marginally better than the cold outside. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of old smoke, dust, and something else. Sickness? Despair? His eyes adjusted to the dim light. The figure by the hearth was a woman, thin to the point of emaciation, wrapped in threadbare blankets. Her face, when she turned towards him, was pale, drawn, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and utter exhaustion. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way she hugged herself as if holding onto the last threads of her life. He saw the state of the cabin, the near-empty wood box, the evident lack of provisions. It wasn't just hardship. It was starvation, isolation, the slow surrender to the elements. Seeing the sheer, bone-deep vulnerability, the quiet suffering etched into her features and the desolate scene around her, something tightened in his chest, a raw, unexpected ache. It wasn't pity, not exactly, but a profound, wordless recognition of struggle and a sudden, fierce urge to something. Protect? Aid? He swallowed, his voice rougher than intended. "Seen your light. Out here alone." She only nodded, unable to speak, her gaze fixed on him, assessing, fearful. He was a large man, bundled against the cold, his face obscured by shadow and the low brim of his hat. To her, he must have seemed like a figure stepping out of the hostile landscape itself. He stood just inside the door, making no move to approach further, giving her space. His gaze swept over the room again, cataloging the bare necessities, the signs of neglect born of inability, not laziness. The fire was indeed dying. "You got wood?" he asked, his voice softer this time. Another slow shake of her head. Her lips were chapped and cracked, her breathing shallow. He could tell she was on the edge. "Snow's deep," he stated the obvious. "Can't stay here like this." He expected resistance, fear, maybe a demand for him to leave. Instead, she simply looked at him, her eyes deep pools of exhaustion, a silent question hanging in the air. What did he want? Why was he here? He removed his gloves slowly, stuffing them into his coat pocket. "Silas," he offered, stating his name, a small gesture of peace. "Live a few miles west." Still, she didn't speak. He needed to break through the fear, the inertia. "Got some jerky in my pack. And a bit of coffee food." The mention of it seemed to stir something in her, a flicker of awareness beyond the immediate fear. He walked back out to his horse, retrieved his pack, and returned. He didn't offer the food directly, didn't want to overwhelm her. Instead, he knelt by the hearth, pulling a small hatchet from his belt. "Need fire," he said, stating the immediate priority. He went back outside, ignoring the biting wind, and began to work on the small, pitiful pile of wood by the porch, splitting it into smaller pieces easier to burn. He brought in an armload, the solid thud of logs a grounding sound in the fragile quiet of the cabin. He added wood to the fire, coaxing the embers back to life until small flames began to lick at the dry kindling. Only then did he return to his pack and take out the jerky and a small tin of coffee. He placed them on the table, not too close to her, but where she could easily reach them. "Eat," he said simply, not meeting her eyes directly. He busied himself with finding water, a frozen bucket near the door, and melting snow in a small pot he found near the hearth. He made the coffee, the rich aroma slowly filling the cabin, a scent of warmth and life that had been absent for too long. He poured the coffee into a chipped mug and set it near the jerky. He sat on the floor near the door, leaning against the wall, giving her the space of the hearth and the table. He didn't push her, didn't ask questions. He simply waited, letting his presence be known, but not demanded. Slowly, tentatively, she reached for the mug, her hand trembling. She cupped it, letting the warmth sink into her fingers, her eyes still wary but the sheer terror having receded slightly, replaced by a cautious observation. She took a sip of the coffee, a soft sigh escaping her lips. It was the first sound he had heard her make, a tiny affirmation of life. He watched her from his position by the door, his gaze steady but not intrusive. He saw her reach for the jerky, break off a small piece, and bring it to her mouth. She chewed slowly, deliberately, as if her body had forgotten how. Each small movement was an act of reclaiming herself from the brink. He stayed there for a long time, silent, a quiet sentinel against the storm outside and the despair inside. He didn't press for her story. It was written plainly on her face, in the state of the cabin, in the deep well of loneliness in her eyes. He had seen versions of it before in this harsh land, dreams dying, people breaking, the wilderness taking its toll. But seeing her, so fragile, so utterly alone, had stirred something he rarely acknowledged. It was the choked him up feeling, not tears, but a tightening, a weight of shared humanity in the face of overwhelming odds. He knew, with a quiet certainty, that he wouldn't be leaving her to face this alone anymore. Not tonight, maybe not ever, until she was strong enough to stand on her own feet. Days blurred into a quiet rhythm dictated by the needs of survival and the slow thaw of mistrust. Silas didn't leave. He simply stayed. He spent his days repairing the cabin, chinking the walls against the drafts, reinforcing the sagging roof, clearing snow from the small yard. He brought in more firewood, building a stack that dwarfed her previous one. He hunted, bringing back rabbits and squirrels, teaching Alara how to skin and prepare them, his movements efficient and silent. He didn't talk much, and neither did she at first. But his presence was a solid thing in the cabin, pushing back the oppressive weight of her solitude. Her strength slowly returned. The jerky and game filled her stomach. The steady warmth of the fire chased the persistent cold from her bones. With physical strength came a slow return of her spirit. She began to move beyond the hearth, helping him with tasks, sorting herbs she had gathered in better times, mending ripped fabric, cleaning the grime that had settled over everything. Her name, Alara, finally came one afternoon as they worked side by side, patching a hole in the roof. Simple, understated. Silas nodded, acknowledging it, but offered no commentary. Their communication remained minimal, a language of shared tasks, quiet observations, and the nonverbal cues that passed between two people navigating the delicate space of unexpected cohabitation. She watched him often when he wasn't looking. The steady competence of his hands, the quiet focus in his eyes, the way he seemed utterly at ease in the wilderness that had nearly broken her. He wasn't conventionally kind, not with effusive words or gentle reassurances. His kindness was in action, the extra blanket he laid over her while she slept, the largest share of the meat he left for her, the way he always made sure the fire was strong before he went out. She began to trust him, not blindly, but with a growing certainty that he meant her no harm, that his motives, while unspoken, were rooted in a simple, deep-seated decency. The fear she had felt upon his arrival had transformed into a cautious respect, then a quiet reliance. She found herself anticipating his return when he went out, a subtle shift in her emotional landscape. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living alongside someone, a shared existence in the vast, indifferent world. One evening, as a fierce wind battered the cabin, making the walls groan, she spoke, her voice still a little weak but steady. "Gideon, my husband. He left for town weeks ago." Before the snow, she didn't look at Silas, staring into the fire. He never came back. It was the first time she had spoken of her past, of the circumstances that had led her to the brink. Silas was silent for a long moment, his gaze on the flames. "This land takes its toll," he said finally, his voice low. It wasn't pity or even sympathy, just a simple statement of fact, a recognition of the harsh reality they inhabited. And in its starkness, it was more comforting than any empty words of condolence could have been. It acknowledged her loss without diminishing her struggle. A different kind of silence settled between them then, one not filled with fear, but with shared understanding, a quiet acceptance of the world's indifference and the strength found in standing together against it. The tentative trust had solidified into something more resilient, a partnership forged in the crucible of necessity. But the winter was far from over, and the world outside their small cabin held other dangers besides the cold. The storm hit with a vengeance 2 nights later, a white hammer pounding at the cabin. The wind shrieked, a banshee trying to tear the roof from the walls. Snow piled in drifts against the door and windows, burying them in a suffocating white blanket. Alara and Silas huddled by the fire, the flames their only defense against the invading cold. The storm was relentless, testing the very foundations of their fragile sanctuary and the tentative bond they had forged. They spoke little, the roar of the wind drowning out all but shouted words. It was a battle against an impersonal, colossal force, and their survival depended on the strength of the structure and their own quiet fortitude. Then came a new sound, a series of heavy thuds against the back wall, followed by a splintering crash. A section of the roof, already weakened, had given way under the weight of the snow and the force of the wind. Icy air and snow blasted into the cabin. Silas was on his feet instantly, moving with a speed that belied his usual measured pace. "Stay back," he shouted over the din. He grabbed blankets, pushing them towards Alara. "Keep the fire going." He then began wrestling with furniture, dragging the heavy table and chairs towards the damaged section, trying to barricade it against the wind and snow. Alara, adrenaline surging, didn't hesitate. She grabbed more wood, pushing it onto the fire, ensuring their core of warmth didn't die. She found a tarp he had used for repairs and, scrambling onto a stool, tried to help him secure it over the gaping hole, fighting against the powerful gusts that threatened to tear it from their grasp. They worked together wordlessly, a single unit focused on the immediate task, their previous caution and reserve forgotten in the face of the shared threat. His hands were strong, his movements decisive. Her smaller size allowed her to maneuver in tight spaces, pushing the tarp where he couldn't reach. Snow and ice plastered their faces, the cold biting deep, but they didn't stop. It felt like hours, a desperate, exhausting struggle against the storm's fury. Finally, with the last of their strength, they managed to secure the tarp reasonably well, stuffing blankets and anything else they could find into the remaining gaps. The wind still howled, and snow still sifted in, but the direct assault had been blunted. They collapsed by the fire, shivering, soaked, but alive. Alara looked at Silas, really looked at him in the firelight. His face was grim, streaked with dirt and snow, but his eyes held a fierce, protective light she hadn't seen before. He met her gaze, and in that shared look, something fundamental shifted. They had faced the storm together, not as two isolated individuals, but as partners in survival. The immediate danger passed as the storm eventually began to subside, leaving behind a world buried deep in snow, but strangely quiet. The cabin was damaged, cold, but it held. As the first light of dawn filtered through the frosted windows, painting the snowscape in hues of pale blue and gold, Alara felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but also something new, a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. She had faced the storm, faced the brink of despair, and she had survived. And she hadn't done it alone. Silas was tending the fire, his shoulders slumped with weariness. He turned to her, his gaze settling on her face. He saw not the fragile, broken woman he had found days ago, but a woman marked by hardship, yes, but also by resilience, by a quiet determination that had flared brightly in the face of the storm. A faint, almost imperceptible nod passed between them, an acknowledgement of what they had been through and what they had become. She had come to this cabin with nothing but loss and fear, facing an end she couldn't escape. Now, standing amidst the wreckage of the storm, she felt a flicker of defiance, a quiet hope. The world was still harsh, still indifferent, but she was no longer the same. She was stronger, marked but not broken, and she was not alone. The journey had been one from vulnerability to an unshakable core of resilience, from despair to a gentle, earned optimism. The rancher had seen lights in the distance, and what he found inside had choked him up with a profound, wordless recognition of shared humanity and the fierce, quiet strength of a spirit refusing to surrender. And in finding her, he had perhaps found a quiet purpose he hadn't known he was missing, a partnership forged not in grand declarations, but in the shared struggle for warmth, shelter, and life itself against the relentless, beautiful, and brutal wild.